October 1942. The Cunard White Star Line's majestic flagship, the RMS Queen Mary, has been re-outfitted and pressed into service ferrying American troops to European battlefields. At 1,019 feet and 81,237 gross tons, the Queen Mary had the best time for crossing the Atlantic. Speed is critical on the ship's unescorted wartime dashes across the Atlantic between New York City and Britain. Nearly 15,000 soldiers are crowded into cramped quarters as the Queen Mary steams off the coast of Ireland, only a few hundred miles from her destination of Clyde. She has picked up a British convoy to protect the valuable cargo of men and materials in the German U-boat-infested waters near Ireland. The Allied command remembers all too vividly the 1915 sinking of the Lusitania by a German U-20 in the Irish Sea and doesn't want a similar tragedy. And so it was that several British destroyers patrolled the waters well ahead of the Queen Mary, while one anti-aircraft cruiser, the 4,200-ton Curaçao, kept a close vigil off the Queen's bow. The procedures for guarding the Queen called for the Curaçao to zigzag ahead, alternating positions from port to starboard, watching for enemy submarines that might try to slip through the forward armada. Somehow a mistake was made. Suddenly, in broad daylight, the Curaçao cut across the Queen's bow too late for the monster of the sea to slow or alter course. The Curaçao was sliced in half. The Queen Mary was relatively unscathed, although a tear in her bow allowed some water to enter a forward compartment. Watertight bulkheads prevented serious damage or possible sinking. The Curaçao went under in less than 5 minutes, carrying 338 sailors to their deaths. Only 101 survived. Many of the deaths were from drowning, since wartime restrictions prevented the Queen Mary from stopping to pick up survivors. A stopped ship the size of the Queen presented an easy target to enemy submarines. A naval inquiry some months later found the Curaçao 2/3 to blame and the Queen Mary 1/3 responsible for the tragedy. There the matter would have ended, an exceedingly sad chapter in the Queen Mary's illustrious transoceanic career if not for a peculiar twist of fate that brought the Queen to Long Beach, California in 1967. She was to be made over into a permanently anchored floating hotel and resort along that city's burgeoning oceanfront. On board the ship's voyage to retirement was one John Smith, a tall, soft-spoken sailor with sharp features and the ruddy complexion of a man at home on the sea. Now retired as the Queen's last chief engineer, Smith stayed aboard while the ship was being outfitted as a tourist attraction. But what John Smith remembers most about his job on the Queen is not the ocean voyage around Cape Horn to Long Beach, for that trip went smoothly enough, nor the months of tedious watch as the grand old lady of the sea was stripped of her engines and made ready for paying customers. He knew that the Queen Mary was a relic of an earlier age, unable to compete with luxurious passenger jets. What was a top speed of 30 knots, after all, when travelers could reach Europe in a matter of hours, not days? What bothered John Smith the most then, and does to this day, were the unexplained sounds and phantom voices he heard on the ship, all originating near the bow of the Queen Mary, in almost the precise location where the Curaçao had punched a hole in her iron skin nearly 4 decades earlier. Smith is precise in his memories.
Queen Mary has a short bow, about 8 decks high, and then a short division after that, but it's just a partial division. There's a larger division about 30 feet after that. And the bow has 6 decks of vertical stairs, goes down to the bottom of the ship, and it's a storage area. Can't store anything there. There's too many girders and beams. And on the last voyage, I didn't know too much about the history of the ship, not even what the general public knows. One of my jobs was to keep the ship from sinking, so I'd roam around with a flashlight. Sometimes I'd go on the top deck and I'd look down those vertical ladders just to make sure that you could get down there with ropes if it was necessary.
Smith adds that his regular patrols continued for several months after the Queen reached her berth in Long Beach. When he reached the bow, Smith would sometimes hear water rushing, as if pipes were breaking or the hull had sprung a leak. Smith would descend the ladder in the forward section of the ship, but the gurgling and rushing sound would gradually fade away.
I'd be really mystified about what I heard and where it came from. There was never anything wrong. There was no explanation for it. And then I would hear this strange tapping sound. And the ship was tied up at the pier near the naval base. So there was no reason for me to hear that. I'd go out, I'd look up and down the deck. I could never explain it. It happened 7, 8 times.
The most unnerving experience for John Smith, however, came on the heels of that rhythmic tapping and the seeming rush of water. Voices. Voices as if from a distance. Smith could hear them crying, moaning, shrieking, even laughing sometimes. Always men's voices. When that phenomenon occurred, Smith left as quickly as possible.
I know that common sense says that something structural or mechanical was causing it, but there were never any problems. No reason for it. But it happened again and again.
It was after he retired that John Smith read a history of the Queen Mary, including an account of the grisly collision with the cruiser Curaçao. Although part of the Queen's bow was torn open, the ship was able to continue on to Scotland for temporary repairs. It was eventually returned to Boston and dry docked while the bow was permanently repaired before the Queen returned to service.
Now, if I'd known about that, it would have all tied in, but I didn't even know about the collision until years later.
He often felt as well as heard something during his watches.
And I would hear a thump, and then a vibration, and then the sound of water gurgling, and then the crying, shrieking. And I would feel the vibration. It was like I was going over a washboard. But it always started with the thump, but it was garbled. It wasn't clear. One sound would fade in, and then another one would fade out. It always happened like that. The whole thing took maybe 60 seconds.
From his research, Smith knows that the mysterious voices came from the same area of the Queen Mary that would have struck the Curaçao. He believes that what he heard on all these occasions were the ghostly, albeit invisible, reenactments of that tragic disaster. John Smith also encountered the ghost of British statesman Winston Churchill on the Queen Mary, or at least the remnants of smoke from Sir Winston's famous cigars. During World War II, while the Queen usually carried American and Allied forces to Europe, a special stateroom was outfitted for the wartime British Prime Minister for his frequent trips to Washington, D.C. Sir Winston preferred to travel by ship rather than by air. A quarter of a century later, the Prime Minister's old stateroom, M115, was given over as a temporary office for Smith during the Queen's renovation in Long Beach.
I definitely smelled smoke in this room, cigar smoke. He had a favorite Cuban cigar he used to smoke. They used to sell them in the coffee shop here on the ship. I think they even called them Winston Churchill cigars. Nothing smelled quite like it, but there it was. And right now, over 20 years later, I'd recognize that smell. Probably recognize it more than anything else.
The odor was most prevalent after hours, when everyone except Smith and a few others had left the ship.
I could see smoke near the ceiling. And the ventilation, it wasn't on, and there was no artificial ventilation. So if there was smoke, it either came in through the door, if it was open, or through the porthole. Somehow the smoke got in here. It happened often, but not all the time. Like 5, 6, 7 days would go by, there'd be nothing. And then I would smell the smoke. And I would step out and I'd look up and down the hallway. I used to think that someone blew smoke through the keyhole. That wasn't it.
As far as Smith could tell, no workman renovating the ship smoked cigars while aboard, and certainly not the distinctive brand Sir Winston preferred. The screams of dying sailors and the sight and smell of cigar smoke aren't the only peculiar remembrances of retired Chief Engineer John Smith. One of the most well-known ghost legends on the old ship concerns not people, but a handsome Irish setter dog whose barking echoes even to this day. John Smith knows the story well.
The kennel was up here on the sun deck. If you were a VIP, like Elizabeth Taylor, you could keep your dog in your stateroom. But everyone else, they had to keep their dog in the kennel. And there was this old Englishman who used to travel with a beautiful Irish setter. It was a very friendly dog. It wagged its tail when strangers came up to it. And he would walk every day up and down the deck. They had a regular walkway here. He didn't even need a leash. The dog would just stay right by him, right by his side. And one night the dog started howling, and it just would not stop howling. So the kennelman called security to see if they could take the dog out of the kennel. They didn't know if it was sick or if it needed food or water, but it wouldn't stop howling and scratching at the exit gate. So finally they sent the security man down to the stateroom to wake the Englishman to see if they could get him to quiet the dog. They didn't want to wake him up at 3 in the morning, but the security, they found the man dead in his room.
John Smith believes the dog somehow sensed his master's death. Shortly after the Queen Mary arrived in Long Beach, Smith heard what he believed was a dog barking on the sun deck. Always the barking was indistinct, a distant baying that was directionless. It seemed to emanate from the old kennel area, yet when Smith and his colleagues got there it seemed remote again, almost as if the spectral dog had run to another part of the ship. Nancy Wozni was a guide and a security officer during the Queen Mary's early years as a tourist attraction in Long Beach. Now an investigator for a Southern California insurance company, Wozni speaks of her uncanny experiences on the ship with the assurance of one who was used to dealing with facts and details. While John Smith never saw an apparition, Wozni had an unnerving encounter with an actual ghost.
My job as the lead tour guide was to close up after the tours. I would reattach the chains, change out the tapes, that sort of thing. I was pretty sure I was the last one on this particular tour.
The tour had taken her to the engine room. She had completed riding up the first escalator to the main deck and was halfway up a second escalator when it happened.
I felt someone behind me. I turned around and I saw a man standing behind me. I feared I'd missed somebody or that it was crew because his overalls were dirty. He had a beard, a beautiful beard, short black hair, and round eyes. His skin was very white, grossly white, and the blue overalls. I kept thinking he was maintenance, and I thought he came up behind me, and I just didn't hear him.
The man wore no expression, looked straight ahead as if Wozni didn't exist.
That was about 2 seconds from the top.
Wozni adds that she reached the top and stepped aside to let the man pass. He wasn't there. Not a word was exchanged between Wozni and the man. Indeed, she turned around because she sensed his presence.
I didn't feel him touch me. I just felt like I wasn't alone. It was three-dimensional and it was very vivid.
Could it have been a maintenance man playing a practical joke on the young guide? Something that wasn't all that unusual? No, answers Wozni.
There was no place for him to go. I mean, he couldn't have reversed himself. It was my job to turn off the escalator. That's what I was doing when I was doing. I was about 3 steps from the top. I turned and I saw him. I turned back thinking I had missed somebody. Stepped aside to let him go by, and when I looked back, he was gone.
There may be a reason for the phantom crewman's visit. According to some sources, a crew member had somehow been crushed in one of the watertight doors during the ship's heyday. His name was John Peter. Wozni thinks the man on the escalator could very well have been Peter. On modern cruise ships, swimming pools are built on open decks to take full advantage of the sun. Passengers can while away their afternoons sitting in deck chairs only a few feet away from the soothing waters of a freshwater pool. The Queen Mary, too, has a swimming pool, but it is as different from those found on today's ships as the opulent mahogany and brass staterooms on the Queen are from the relatively Spartan cabins on ships that cater to tourists on a budget. The Queen's swimming pool is quite small, but installed in an area the size of a gymnasium deep within the bowels of the ship. There was little reason to build a swimming pool on an open deck for a vessel plying the North Atlantic. The pool is kept half filled with water to prevent cracks and to show modern visitors what passengers in the 1930s considered a luxurious touch. Soft, indirect lighting casts subtle shadows on the Art Deco designs, lending an altogether ethereal feeling to the area. 2 stairways lead down to the pool deck from a spacious entryway. Sturdy columns surround the pool, rising dozens of feet to the ceiling above. Even a diving board stands unattended at the pool's deep end. But all is not quiet here. Several current and former employees say that a woman swims in that pool, a bather who could very well be a ghost. Wozni was near the railing at the entrance, gazing down at the pool when she saw the woman.
It was almost like I caught her in another dimension. I couldn't see her face, but I saw her form. I saw her bathing suit, but everything was void of color. She wasn't transparent. Though she didn't appear before my eyes, she didn't disappear before my eyes.
The former guide and security officer Nancy Wozni is one who has seen the ghostly bather.
I thought she'd step back from the pillar. I disconnected the rope, blocking the stairs, very quickly and ran down, because I thought I was a tourist.
According to Richard Curlin, a spokesman for the Queen Mary, a woman passenger drowned in the pool during the 1960s. Who she was and under what circumstances she died are not known. But that fact alone makes the sightings of a ghostly bather even more plausible. The startled young guide quickly looked behind the column, only to be dumbfounded by finding absolutely no one there. She noted that the other doors leading into the pool area were closed, with no other way for the intruder to have escaped. Veteran Queen Mary security officer Billy Thompson echoes those who can't explain the phenomenon.
The pool's an amazing place because all the doors down there are on the alarm, so anyone who sets foot through those doors triggers the sensors. And the alarms would go off at night, and we'd go down there, and there's nobody. We even staked it out a couple of times to see if maybe somebody was down there trying to steal something.
Thompson and other guards would hide in the old dressing rooms or showers hoping to catch the culprits. They never did, and, if one is to believe the accounts, probably couldn't if they tried. So far as is known, a ghost has never been captured.
All of a sudden, alarms would go off, and yet there was nobody. We even saw water on the floor by the pool where it was dry before, and the water's moving.
At other times, Thompson would edge even closer to the pool so that all he had to do was look around a corner to get a clear view of anyone swimming. Then he would hear a splash, as if someone had jumped in the water. He quickly thrust his head out, and although the water was roiling, the pool was quite empty.
You figure that one out.
Inexplicable activity is not limited to the Queen Mary's first-class swimming pool, shaft alley, escalators, or bow. Nor does it appear that the hauntings are always deliberate, occurring numerous times in a single place. Sometimes the acts are random, more indicative of traditional poltergeist activity. Ellie Mae is a waitress of long standing aboard the Queen. She has worked over the years in all of the ship hotel's dining areas, including the elegant main dining salon where sumptuous Sunday brunches are a Long Beach tradition, and the Pig and Whistle, a quaint tavern modeled after an old English pub.
I've seen plates fly clear across the room, break into pieces for no reason. They landed right in the middle of the floor.
The early morning hours, before the restaurants opened to customers, were the times when she witnessed most of the events.
It was me and this gal named Peggy. She's not here anymore. And we were standing by the steam table. And I thought the poor child was going to faint right there. It picked up the plates and threw them like a frisbee. about 3 of them, a few seconds apart, and they went straight from the steam table right into the middle of the room.
In late spring 1989, Ellie Mae had a second encounter with poltergeist activity. Shortly after she arrived at work at 5 o'clock in the morning, Ellie Mae heard the scream of a waitress in a workroom near the Pig and Whistle.
Somebody tried to pick up the table where she was sitting. It just started shaking, and she screamed at the top of her lungs. She was terrified. I came in, and the pictures were upside down on the wall by the front door. I fixed them, but the chef said I should have had a camera so I could tell security about it.
Ellie Mae finds it impossible to believe that the other waitress or someone unknown could have caused either bit of mischief. She was usually at work a few minutes before 5, preparing for the day's customers alone or with another early arriving waitress. It would be extremely difficult for an intruder to get in without Ellie Mae's knowledge.
Shauna Duke is a former guide who did quite a bit of exploring on the old passenger liner to satisfy her interest in its intriguing history. She found one section that caused her to listen more attentively to the tales told by other employees.
I was up in the bow of the ship, and it was cold, meat locker cold. And it's the whole of the ship, it's not air conditioned, it gets really hot in there. I did not stay that day. I went right in and I came right back out.
Duke described that part of the ship as a working area for crew members. It's off limits to visitors and normally locked. The sudden cold struck Duke as being more odd than frightening, but she still can't explain what could have caused such a plunge in temperature inside the hull of an enormous ship on a simmering summer day.
There was another time when I was taking a tour through the ship, and we were in this one part down below decks, and we were getting ready to leave the room, and all of a sudden the door slammed shut and it was locked on us and we couldn't get out. And right before the door shut, I thought I'd seen somebody walk by, so I was calling out and asking them to come and open the door, and nobody could hear us, nobody came, so I had to call security. And security came and let us out, and they said that there hadn't been anyone down there who could have possibly closed the door on us.
Among the entertainment for day visitors and overnight guests aboard the Queen Mary Hotel are tours of various parts of the ship. Brave souls can venture through haunted Shaft Alley and the nearby first-class swimming pool, or they might wish to view a furnished luxury suite as it was decorated in the 1930s. On either tour, cheerful guides explain the intricacies of life among the well-to-do travelers of half a century ago. What they may not explain is the case of the disembodied voice Nancy Wozni heard as a chief guide some years ago. On this day, it was Wozny's assignment to trail each tour group, shutting doors and turning off lights in the suite exhibit as the last of the tourists passed her way in order to prevent anyone from getting lost or, even worse, vandalizing the exhibit. Nancy Wozni was listening to the tour guide explain the luxuries of first-class passage when she was startled out of her reverie.
It was a joke being played on me. I was in the suite exhibits. The tour guides were on one side of the wall to that area, and they were to bring the group around past me. I was going to go ahead and lock the front doors after them. I was listening to her talk about the suite exhibit. I had my clipboard in my hand, and I leaned against the wall. And just as I touched it, came...
No!
The hair stood on the back of my neck. But I thought it was my supervisor who crept up and was trying to scare me. I reeled around to hit him, and he wasn't there.
In fact, no one was there who could have uttered that single, clear, frightening word. The voice came from directly behind her, at the instant she touched the woodwork.
The voice sounded human because I thought it was my supervisor. I ran to the phone, called him, and he answered it.
That would have been 5 decks down and 1,000 feet away, she estimates. Nancy Wozni filed that incident away until a friend of hers, now deceased, had a strange experience in the same suite exhibit area. Wozni explained that her friend was standing near a 3-way mirror on the hinged doors that opened into a small room. Suddenly, the doors started to rattle and then flew open. 2 beams of light, like a pair of headlamps, bounced up and down in the dim, closet-like room.
She was hysterical when it happened.
Once she got the woman calmed down, Wozni said they began comparing notes and realized they had both encountered these unknown forces in approximately the same space in the suite's exhibit. That's when they started telling other employees of their experiences.
I'm not spiritual. I don't necessarily believe in these things, but I know what I saw, and I can't explain it.
She definitely believes the frightening story told by two other guides who came to her in tears one afternoon. Both had been on the engine room platform in Shaft Alley when they distinctly heard a man clearing his throat, as if he wanted to call attention to himself, only they couldn't see anyone else to pay attention to. When a chain hanging from a ceiling pipe started to arc through the air, the pair fled.
They both saw it, and they were both hysterical. They wouldn't go near the area again. It scared them to death.
The RMS Queen Mary enjoyed a popularity on the Long Beach waterfront equaled by only a few other Southern California attractions. Each year, thousands of tourists queued up to tour the Grand Dame of the Seas, spend a night or weekend luxuriating in one of the exquisitely decorated stateroom suites in the Queen Mary Hotel, or partake of a sumptuous Sunday brunch in the elegant first-class dining room. Her engines have long since been removed, and permanent gangplanks and cables anchor the ship tightly to a visitor center. But the Queen Mary still exudes a majesty, an almost palpable sensation of power and repose. A visitor need not even shut his eyes to imagine the gleaming black and red hull splitting the turbulent whitecaps as the ship raced across the ocean. Heavy black smoke pouring from her triple smokestacks as she tried to outrace the inexorable passage of an era. The ghostly crewman on the escalator, a bather who refuses to leave the pool, echoing voices of doomed sailors, and all the other peculiar phenomenon are also part of the Queen Mary's captivating legacy. And so it should be, that a ship which touched so many lives should harbor secrets beyond the ken of mere mortals.